Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here with us for our second Dialogues Voices from Performance event of this academic year. Thank you for holding on with us as we figured out some technical difficulties and figure out how to maneuver between all of the different programs. I would like to begin this event by acknowledging the land that we're on here at Central Washington University. So Central Washington University honors the Native people and land on which CWU is located in Kittitas County. It is the historic home of the Yakama people. The federally recognized confederated tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation is made of the Klickitat, Paulus, Walla Walla, Munapum, Wenatchee, Wishram, and Yakama people. The Yakama people remain committed stewards of this land, cherishing it and protecting it as instructed by elders through generations. We are honored and grateful to be here today on their traditional lands. We give thanks to the legacy of the original people, their lives, and their descendants. For those who are joining us for the first time, Dialogues is a colloquium series which seeks to highlight the work of artists, scholars, and activists of the global majority in the fields of theater, dance, and performance studies. This series is supported by the Lynn Thayer Grant, the Department of Theater, the Ghostlight Project, and gracious donors like you. Today, we welcome director Rudy Ramirez and playwright Jesús Valles. Rudy Ramirez is a director, writer, and performer focused on the development of new work. They are the founding artistic director of Avante Theater Project, dedicated to producing new and avant-garde Latinx Latine work, and associate artistic director of the VORTEX. They have directed pieces for numerous numerous companies around the country, including Austin Bike Zoo, Color Art Productions, the Lark, National Queer Theater, New York Theater Workshop, the Playwrights Center, Red Bull Theater, the San Antonio Public Theater, ScriptWorks, Shrewd Productions, Sky Candy Aerial Arts, Southwestern University, Teatro Audaz, Teatro Vivo, and the University of Texas at Austin. Rudy has received 7 B. Iden Payne Awards, though I think maybe that's gone up since then, and an Austin Critics Table Award for directing. They were named Best Director by the Austin Chronicle Readers Poll in 2017 and received an artistic residency in 2020 with Texas Performing Arts and Fusebach Festival to develop 3 new Latinx plays. Nationally, they have been finalists for the NNPN Directors Fellowship and the TCG Alan Schneider Award. They have a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and MA in Performances Public Practice from UT Austin, and are currently in their second year as an MFA candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Jesús Valles is a queer Mexican immigrant educator, storyteller, and performer from Ciudad Juarez, El Paso. Jesús is a 2021 Canto Mundo Fellowship recipient at the Palm Beach Poetry Festival, a 2019 Lambda Literary Fellow, a 2019 Walter E. Dakin Playwriting Fellow of the Sewanee Writers Conference, a recipient of the 2019 Letras Latinas Scholarship from the Community of Writers Poetry Workshop, and a Poetry Fellow at Idlewild Arts Writers Week. Jesús is also a 2018 UndocuPoets Fellow, a 2018 Tin House Scholar, a Fellow of the 2018 Poetry Incubator, and the runner-up in the 2017 Button Poetry Chapbook Contest. Their work has been published in the Shade Journal, the Texas Review, the New Republic, Palabritas, the Acentos Review, Quarterly West, the Mississippi Review, Palette, the Edroid Journal, BOAAT, the McNeese Review, and Pank. Their poetry has been featured on NPR's Code Switch, The Slowdown, the Breakbeat Poets Latinx Anthology, and the Best New Poets 2020 Anthology. As an actor, they are the recipient of 4 B. Iden Payne Awards, including Outstanding Lead Actor in a Drama and Outstanding Original Script, and was nominated for the Mark David Cohen New Play Award for their play Undocuments. They most recently starred as Penny Marshall and Victor Cazares' Pinching Pennies with Penny Marshall, Death Rituals for Penny Marshall, for the New York Theater Workshop. Jesús is currently Outsider Festival's Outsider in Residence and an MFA playwriting student at Brown University. Rudy, Jesús, thank you so much for joining us this morning. So many accolades and places to list. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you, Natasha, for that like lovely introduction. And I'm also like, wow, bios.
Yeah.
Flip our hair a lot.
Yeah, it's the point to celebrate yourself. So welcome. Our goal this morning is I wanted to bring you here to talk about Undocuments, right? And the work that you've done as both playwright and director and how that relationship works, right? Because in theater, we're always talking about collaboration. And what a wonderful way to talk about it than to hear from people who've been working on new work together. But as most of our audience probably hasn't seen Undocuments, could you tell us a bit about the play and maybe your inspirations for or source material for writing the piece? Like where did this come from?
Yeah. I would love to try something. Rudy, actually, like I would love to hear you describe the play.
How dare you? Gosh, okay. So well, I think it helps to sort of like start with just the story of maybe how I came to it. Jesús showcased an amazing collection of poems at a performance at the VORTEX, which is the theater where I primarily work in Austin and where I'm associate director. And those poems were incredible. And Jesús talked about this being the beginning of a solo show. I've been working with Jesús ever since I saw Jesús half naked, covered in red glitter, and was like, that is absolutely the person I want to work with so many times. And so
it was in a show. It was in a show. So
some context for that.
I feel like context is good, but also it could have not been.
Although honestly, like, yeah, that was to say, it's like that kind of context. There are many contexts in which that's appropriate. So I approached Jesus by saying, I'd love to help put this together and direct this piece. And this is a collection of poems coming together to tell Jesus's story of coming to the United States undocumented, and in particular, the growing up right, at the border at this arbitrary violent line, and how, because two nations have claimed opposite sides of a river, how that divides a family that would naturally be crossing over this river, like crossing over this land, and I think this is about the violence of citizenship. One of my favorite moments as we were developing this was thinking about how, the citizenship oath has this very magical, arcane language to it. I think the word abjure is used in there. And I'm just like, I normally think of that in like, I immediately think of sorcerers when I hear that word. I think of just like Dungeons and Dragons, and so how, but this is a magic that does tremendous violence to people. And the name Undocuments in particular, coming from the idea that, as is often spoken about, is that, we have all these papers that are meant to be records of our existence. And these papers are legal documents, but that don't tell our story, and in so many ways limit our stories, police us, and divide us from ourselves, limit our identities, and how those shouldn't be the documents that survive. That we need to create our own documents of survival, and that tell us in our fullness. And so I think that's what I've really have come to love about the play, is that like I think that there are so many stories that are very American dream, and very sort of just like, let me prove to you why it should be such a wonderful thing that I come to the United States. But this is about how that process is inherently violent, inherently limiting, and that the very nature of the system itself needs to be completely re-examined, so we can open up into a space of real living and dreaming beyond the buzzword of being a quote unquote dreamer.
Yeah, all of those things. And
did I get it right?
It was really good. It was really good. Yeah, no, I would say like, yeah, in terms of thinking about documents too, I think I've also had like a really interesting relationship with like playwright as a title, or like calling this a play. I think at the very beginning of it, I was really resistant. I was like, it's a performance, it's a solo piece, it's a because I do think I was actually performing the piece at Louisiana State University maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago. And at one point during a talk back, one of the professors was like, oh, I'm really fascinated by the way that time works in this thing, because you sort of move us from time to time to time, while we acknowledge that we're sitting in like a presentness with you. And then he said, and then if you're really tracking it, the story just sort of dissolves. Like we sort of like, we're following this family, and there's a certain point where it just sort of like comes undone. It sort of becomes detached. And I think when I first started writing the piece, I think, I came to theater primarily as like an actor and as a performer, and not as a writer. And I think I had such deep respect for playwrights and the way that they have a mind for architecture in the work they make. And I think there's something about documents that has always felt like messy. Like it's always felt like, yeah, it's like it's a thing that has scenes showing, and the sort of like challenge of the thing is like, how can I distract you from looking at the seams? Because the seams are actually like not important. And so yeah, I think thinking about it as a solo piece that I now feel actually really comfortable calling a play, in that yeah, I also think I think we're long overdue, obviously, for really like breaking up how we think about what a play is and what playwriting looks like in an American context, because other countries are already saying like, yeah, like this is a play, and also like it's 12 people dancing on stage silently, and I feel like we still have such a steadfast holding on to language and its preciousness. And that's not to say that I don't invest in that, but I think one of the things that I found working on the documents with Rudy was like a dedication to what the body can write that can't be scripted. There were so many moments where I would be moving through a piece and I would keep forgetting like the phrasing of a certain like stanza, or like I would like drop a line constantly in the same spot. And there was one rehearsal, we were maybe like a week away from tech, and Rudy was like, cut it. Like your body clearly wants to forget this line. It clearly doesn't need it. So cut it. Like, what are ways to move in this thing that become the language of the piece itself? So I think, yeah, to go back to some of the things that Rudy was saying too, I also like, it is absolutely an autobiographical solo performance about what it means to come to this country as an undocumented subject, and then have the like immigration system really permeate every single person in a family at like a muscular level. In the piece, I talk about when my brother was deported, like what detention did to his body. I mean, like he literally became smaller because of what rations and like and meals look like in a detention center. And so, I think it's very much like a play that follows that story. And also, as Rudy was saying, I think for me, the writing really was a commitment to like leave behind a document for when I am dead that isn't a birth certificate or a naturalization form or, a Nelnet student loan that I've yet to pay. Or like a bill from Torrid. So yeah, these are the things I don't want to leave behind. Why not a play instead?
I love the bill from Torrid. Yeah. I hear a lot of things in what you've both said, right? I hear a questioning and a pushing back of the archive, right? And what the archive wants to hold on to, and what you are saying is, no, I'm going to add to that archive. I'm going to explode that archive, right? I'm going to offer more than what it wants to keep. I would love to hear more about that. Like what kind of, Yeah, if you could speak more to like making your own archive and how Undocuments fits into this being a part of your archive, but also maybe even how it's a part of the archive for your family and community.
Yeah. At almost every single like talk that I've been invited to, I'll have someone ask, and sometimes in talkbacks after the show too, I'll have people ask, "Has your family seen the show?" And like I would never like voluntarily invite my parents to anything I do. Like I just wouldn't. I think this one specifically, I think if I were to be like, "Hey, come see the show," I think like, "Oh, we lived it. We're good. Like we're all right." But uh, I do think there is an interesting thing that happens. And I'll talk about it this way. I think my friend Josimar tweeted the other day, or maybe stole a tweet that was like, queer people are the celebrities in their families. Like that's who like, and I kept thinking about when the play was streaming with Teatro Audaz in November, I was posting about it on social media. Everybody was home because pandemic gigs. And it's one of those moments where you post something and you forget that your family follows you. So I forgot that like I have like nephews and cousins and like in-laws who like follow me on Instagram and Facebook. And so like I remember getting a message during the run from my nephew who was like, "Hey, just want to let you know I watched the show with my mom today. His Spanish isn't great and her English isn't like the best." And so they watched the show together and just were sort of like translating for each other back and forth. But then he was like, "Yeah, I actually didn't know a whole bunch of this." And so like he got to ask her questions about the family inside of the performance, which I thought was a really weird way to like, there's something kind of cool about being able to talk during a show because it's digital. And I kept thinking a lot about like, and I'll speak for my family, but we're photo hoarders. Like my mother will not let anyone have any pictures. A lot of the pictures that show up in the show I stole from her because I was like, if I ask, you're not going to let me. And so I think we do have such I think there's something about migration and specifically like forced migration that happens through like the negligence of a country that makes you want to remember as much as you can all of the time. And forget too, like there's a whole bunch of stuff you want to forget, but I keep thinking about like all of the photo albums we have and all of the pictures and all of the people who are no longer living who we hold on through in pictures, and how whenever there would be quinceañeras in Mexico, people would send VHS tapes of the quinceañera so people could experience the party here. And I think we have always been forced to be our own historians and our own archivists. And I wonder and think about the play as sort of maybe hopefully living in the same tradition of archiving that has already existed in Mexican sort of migrant communities already. Yeah, so I'll say that for now. I think about that idea of the archive, and then Rudy.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. I think about how you got me thinking about my own family and our relationship with photos, particularly like my mom's family, which is also from the border from Del Rio, and how like the last time we all met was sadly for an aunt's funeral, but like we were actually going through old photos and we would take a photo of the photo with a camera phone, and like it's like photos from like the 30s that we still had, and that they would let the camera phone would actually take the blurry photo and make it more detailed because of the technology. And just like, and I think that there is this archiving that happens that is again very personal. And then I think at the same time that the picture that was on the slide is from the iteration of Undocuments that was done at the Mexican American Cultural Center in Austin. And that was a set design by Maggie Armendariz. And her concept for it was a literal tidal wave of papers that was sort of like behind Jesus and arcing over them. And I think that that's something that we wanted to really convey all the time with this show, is just the overwhelmingness of papers that you face when you are trying to deal with citizenship, and how like and it's documentation that it's a documentation that you're not doing for yourself. You are not creating this archive for yourself or for your family. You're creating the archive for the state. Like the state demands an archive of you, and it demands it in ways that are completely impersonalized, and it will literally quiz you on your own archive, you know. And so this idea that that there's this, it's almost like this overflowing monster of an archive is sort of in certain ways the enemy of the show. You know, it's this like it's this, you know, that it's a tidal wave, but it's also almost like a monster opening its mouth, you know. And I think that was something that that the design always wanted to try to convey, is just making sure we were like, all right, we need a desk that's full of papers, and it was always just like, let's get more and more papers and put them on there, but then also like try to, you know, use them in certain ways that there can be meaning made out of them, you know, so that they became at certain points, different iterations, like the family tree, you know, was made out of these documents. Or one of my favorite moments in the show, like I show a clip of this to my fundamentals of acting student, because we always start with solo performance. And, you know, that moment when, you know, Jesus's mother gives birth, and it's like two pieces of paper, and one is pulled out of the other one and becomes the child, you know. And it's just like that, these moments where it's a violent archive, but one at the same time, like, you know, does form a record that is accessible sometimes, you know, but I think that overall, I think it's a question of who is this archive for, and how much is it asking of us, and what is it asking of us?
As both of you spoke, I thought back to last year we had Golden join us. Golden is a poet and photographer. Yeah, exactly. And right, they talked a lot about documenting things through photography, and so I'm hearing this connection, right? And at once I hear you talking about undocuments and crossing the border, and that violence that happens there, but I'm also wondering about the documentation of queerness, right? And so how those are working in tandem as you're thinking about undocuments, or as you produce undocuments. Is there anything that you could say to that, like the role of just like queerness and queer archives and that sort of work?
Rudy, you want to start? Because I have some thoughts.
Oh, there's a specific line I'm thinking about. You know, like there's like the line is like an archive of brown dicks, like and because I think that I think with that, as an archive of queerness, I think on the one hand, this is in many ways about how queerness runs contrary to so many American narratives. And, you know, when you're sort of like called upon to, you know, like to justify your Americanness, or to claim Americanness, how queerness runs contrary to so much of that. And at the same time, how like it's interesting because there's also moments of toward the beginning of this play where the ways in which, like, you know, like Jesus's brother being like a little league star, like being sort of more traditionally like what we think in terms of masculine, makes like wins a kind of acceptance, and in some ways also American, like there's an Americanness that is sort of like, well, like there's a moment of just like, well, if I will get this country to love me, you know, and that it is like there's moments of connecting to like Fran Drescher as a queer as a Lady Liberty that I think is particularly like to queer people is just sort of like, oh, like that outsider who's a little too much and who wears leopard print and red and like and these sort of these particular American documents that are very salient to like growing up a queer person in the United States. And I'm talking about things like you know, the Julia Sugarbaker speech from Designing Women, and like Dorothy from the Golden Girls, and Buffy, and like all these things that are sort of that. So there's these sort of two opposite tracks happening in the piece, where on the one hand, you know, America is sort of like delighting you and tempting you with all these sort of like queer coded things, but at the same time saying that this is something that is not acceptable here. And so I think a lot of that then becomes, like I said, like the thing about that archive of Brown Dicks at one point was this is talking about encountering somebody like hitting on them in an extremely, you know, racist way, and fetishize, like they did that fetishization, which is always, you know, which is a pretty common experience, that these are two ways in which, like, you know, a body is made unacceptable, and also how I could put this way, that how like there's ways in which, you know, like an immigrant narrative or a Latinx liberation narrative, and then like a gay rights, and I use that term specifically, gay rights narrative, how each of them pushes the other one out of the picture. You know, how each one is like how, you know, part of this, you know, sort of American dream identity is about, you know, saying, you know, a heteronormative lifestyle, and a lot of like gay liberation has been very white supremacist in, you know, the moves that it's made. And so it's like, this is a record of, you know, a body that is doubly cast out, but I think therefore also made doubly powerful and doubly insightful.
I love that. I love that you ended on that, really. I kept thinking about my friend Laura a few years ago was like, it's so weird that you have as many friends as you do. Like, you're queer, you're fat, you're an immigrant. You're literally like a lot of things this country hates. What's going on? And you know, she meant it really lovingly, but I think there's something really interesting about like that. I wonder about what space performance and theater allows, right? And I think this is a kind of forever question of theater performance, as it invites the outsider, right? But like, how do you put the subject that is in danger because it poses a danger or threat to like an American hegemony, right? Like in plain sight, and make that subject the speaking subject, the subject that controls the time that the audience experiences. I think there's something really like valuable and powerful and like dommy about that, which I dig. And I think it, you know, really, I think articulated the queerness question really beautifully. But I think that the last thing that I'm thinking about is at a show in Wisconsin a few years ago. I had a professor who was in the English department and is a queer scholar, and she watched the show and she was like, "This was really fantastic." And I would love to ask, you know, like, where do you think queerness is in the show? And I think there was a moment where I was like, oh no, like did I underwrite queerness in the show? Like, is it not? And then I was like, well, I'm performing it, and I don't think anything about this ever said butch. So, and later at the VORTEX in the 2019 restaging, during the Q&A, somebody asked about like, oh, like what is your training as an actor? And one of the things I landed on was like, oh, like, well, like no official training. Like, I literally was just somebody who was like binge drinking and decided to do theater to not do it as much. But I was like, oh, gay bars. Like, I think queer spaces really, like, queer spaces are really fantastic places to like attune your instrument as like a performer, because they ask you to fight music. So projection is a thing. And they really ask a lot of like of how you present the body, like, right? Like how you present the body as like a body having fun, as a body in ecstasy, as a body dancing, as a body to be desired, as a body that doesn't want, as a body that refuses. I think there's like a sense of like, of what I'll call like a sort of like ecological attunement that happens in the queer space that really teaches a lot of us to perform. And I think the performance of it, and I think alongside sort of like Rudy's direction and encouragement and invitation of the body as a piece of text in it too, I think for me feels like a really kind of like lovely archiving of what can be learned in queer spaces. That is like ephemeral too, right? Like it goes away the moment I, stop.
Yeah, and I think it's worth saying, like, I think that I'm really glad Jesús also brought up like fat as part of this thing, as I think that one of the last things that I saw before the pandemic was A Strange Loop, which is about being a fat queer Black person, and there was so much in there that felt like it was one of the first times that I was ever in a theater, and it was like felt weird being around everybody because it felt so intimate, to my own experiences. I know, which obviously I don't share all of them, but like particularly like the fat experiences, and I think that I mean, and it's worth noting, I mentioned, where, the context under which I met Jesús, and it was at a show called Fat the Play. And I think that the unruliness of the fat body, and particularly, I think the way that the way that you often get interpolated when you're fat in gay spaces, either, like, again, there's fetishization that happens. There's also like utter rejection and like ignorance that happens. And the idea of articulating that body is desirable, that body is powerful, the fat body is all these things as well, is it's yet another outlaw example of the outlaw facet of the performance.
Thank you. I'm also glad that you brought up fatness. I mean, obviously, it's one of the things I think about in performance and on the stage, and what we see and what we don't see. So thank you for bringing that in. I want to acknowledge that there have been some comments, and so I want to make sure that we make space for those. A couple of comments. Jesús, I can relate with you regarding we have been forced to be our own his, her, they Torian of our people, community, and our own life experiences. Christina goes on to say, Rudy, yes, the documentations we are producing is to legitimize our existence in humanity, not for inspiring and empowering our own communities with our story. Thank you for sharing. And then Jackson asks, how do you stage the use of documents in the story? I love the idea of it, but I'm so curious on how it will be highlighted and treated in regards to staging.
Is this I wonder if, yeah, so I mean, I'll start with the text, and then I think Rudy, I would love for you to sort of think through, what was happening for you as a director. But when I started the show, as Rudy was saying earlier, the play started off as a series of kind of 20 poems, ostensibly about migration, about my family, about me. But the sort of poem that really that starts the thing is called Start Here. And the poem begins with the first lines of the file form N400, which is then the naturalization application. And I think I just kept thinking about when I started writing that poem and thinking about the show, I was like, what could you possibly write on a naturalization application that would get it rejected? Because the information they want to know about you is actually so little, right? They want to know as bare bones you as possible, so that it's easy to dismiss you, so that it's easy to deport you, so that it's easy to sort of to have you, right? To take you. And so I think in the writing, I return to the questions in that file, in the N400 as sort of like prompts for getting me to like the next part of the story. So like when my sister is born, for example, in 95, who becomes like a big part of the reason we migrated, one of the questions for filing for residency is, are you the immediate relative of a US citizen? Because my mother happened to have crossed to the US when she was about to give birth, my sister was born a citizen who then lived in Mexico with me, who was nothing, from two parents who were legal residents. So like the sort of like the math and logic of these forms became really helpful in that they became the structure I wanted to break, even as it prompted me inside the show. And then I'll really talk about like staging and some of the sort of use of actual paper and form.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was like quite from the beginning. It felt like the somewhat obvious choice again to have so much paper on stage. Particularly there's a line, after Jesus's brother has been deported, of just like of talking about the amount of documents that filled the table as they were sort of trying to figure out how to help, how to do something, and I think that and to me that felt like one of the most important images to see was just like a table full of papers, such that you can't really do anything else on that table. And so, and we piled like we piled a lot of papers on there. I think I still probably would have wanted more if I could have had my druthers. And we had also a box full of papers on the floor. And again, thinking about what are all the different things you can do with a piece of paper. And again, there's that moment when like Jesús has a couple of papers and like pulls one like a magic trick almost, even though it's just pulling two pieces of paper apart from one another, but it's like that's giving birth. It's like the piece of paper that is my mother has produced the piece of paper that is my sister. Anne-Marie Gordon was our first set designer on the piece, who Anne-Marie was the set designer of VORTEX for many, many years, recently retired. We miss her. We began with, we really wanted a minimalist set, and we just wanted a painting of the Rio Grande and its tributaries in the set. So, and then as that river went up onto the wall, putting the pieces of paper on that river as it looked more like a family tree, looked more like these people produce one another. But then I think that also that there was a number also of moments when we had things, like I think about, when you have a box full of documents in your house, it usually isn't just documents. There's quite often other things that we like shove in there. And so having that be where we get the baseball cap that really connects Jesús to their brother. And also like one of my favorite moments, and I'm like starting to laugh a little bit because it's like, of course, the one night that we filmed was the one night where it like kind of got messed up. Is that, Jesús has all these papers toward like it's sort of like it's in certain ways a 3-act piece. And at the end of that first act, right as Jesús is approaching citizenship, they've got this big stack of papers, and it's sort of like ripping the papers out of this pile as they go through, asking these questions and getting closer and closer and closer, and then finally, like as the citizenship ceremony happens, all the papers get tossed aside, and there's just this little plastic and plastic fabric American flag. And it's the kind that you might have like at a parade or something. So these papers reveal this thing that that's at the end, his father talks about like putting that flag somewhere, and that became this sort of moment of like, okay, we're getting citizenship, and we play the national anthem and things like that, and it's reads as a deeply tragic moment. But then I think that there's like from there, I think it's my favorite moment of the show in terms of like the combination of like the language and the acting and the movement and the light and everything else is just going from there into this sort of like this much more powerfully magical space of thinking about history and thinking about what we've become, what Jesús has become, and the movement of just like ripping apart the mouth. It was like it reminded me almost of like images of like Coatlicue, the Mexica goddess, and the light goes from like red and blue to like greens and oranges, and like these papers get like tossed around as sort of just like this. It is that moment of saying this archive is meaningless. This archive is arbitrary. This archive is a cage. And here is this beast insisting that it will not be caged. And then after that, you just got to pick the papers up because you got to go on with the show. Which I think is another thing, is that, you know, the end of the show ends with, you know, Jesús talking to their father, who's newly gained citizenship, and saying, "What are you going to do now?" It's like, "Pues nada," you know, like it's just like, you know, it's you just keep going, and so that it's not that in the piece we don't come to a point of saying, let's go actually burn down this archive. Although I hope that's a possibility hanging in the air by the end of it. But I do think that we have to keep going in our lives, even as we face, you know, what this does to us.
Yeah, just kind of making space for that. Thank you. Jesús, I know when we talked a while ago, you were thinking about showing clips, perhaps. Do you still want to do that? Would you like
can,
to?
yeah. I actually that section that Rudy just described is the section that I have queued up right now.
Okay.
If you'd like to, yeah. So
I think it might be good. Do you have sharing abilities?
Yeah. You're gonna get to see my like viewed related videos, which is just a lot of with Katya and Trixie, because that's who I am as a person.
You'd watch that too.
that hate crime is not my problem. All right. So I'll share. The
immigration agent who asked me 10.
Yeah, this is a clip from that ceremony. I'm gonna play it and then let me know how sound is.
10 questions and then just gave the fuck up on the last two.
Can you? There's a bar in the like middle of the screen. Do you have something there?
Yeah.
If you can move that bar. Yeah.
The Zoom bar?
Yeah, I think it's the Zoom bar that's in the way.
That might go away on its own if it's like you are sharing or something.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, that helps.
I'm gonna mute myself and then I'm gonna play the clip.
Okay.
Let me know if you can hear the sound though.
And then I am waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting. And here I am at the ceremony, becoming the thing I've worked so hard to make all these years. Tiny American flag, wave it. Across from me, rows of soldiers are promising to die for their papers. Next to me, a woman is becoming a citizen today too. Korean. She's 57. She's crying. Her mother died 3 years ago, but attending her funeral would have put her paperwork to waste. Citizenship means you always grieve from far away. Wave the flag. Hand over your heart. I hereby declare on oath that I absolutely and entirely renounce and abjure any allegiance or loyalty to any foreign prince, state, or sovereignty of where or whom I have heretofore been a subject to or citizen. American. It's not a lie this time. It tastes like iron and blood and something sad and vast. Wave the flag. Here I am. citizen. I have become a snake thing, a half thing, a liar. My mouth trips and stumbles over consonants and syllables split. This tongue into the mouth of a dragon, a clockwork, a serpent, a beast. And wasn't the wisdom of the snake always treated as deceit? Didn't they tell you never to trust the thing that came to your land, crawling, forked tongue? Spirits might speak in too many tongues. Didn't they want to build a wall once? Didn't they cut out our tongues once, searing the wound in fear we were hydras? 2 more tongues in a mouth that once was home to just one. Mi lengua dances in 2 languages, both of them conquered into my mouth. My molars, a soft soil to plant flags in. My mouth, a place to occupy. Mis labios, my lips, my magic, mystic mistake. And what good is a magic tongue if I never feel like its master? By all means, I am American dreamed. My parents now own a home on the money of a maid and a construction worker. And then, of course, there is my little sister, their youngest, their born citizen, and me, naturalized. Yes, oh my God, we stand. And my brother, and all of us living in a house together, making American. And my brother, Gobelin, no papers. Still, my brother is my blood, just as bad as mine, and now I drink too much and I curse too much too, and I am big and vulgar always, and still, we're different. My brother Gobelin is a man, and I'm not doing all that. I am soft and hard, pan dulce. My brother Gobelin is 10 years older than I am. We share very few common interests. La borrachera, pa eso sí, como dice mi mamá. La putería, our hunger, our drinking, our dancing. Different fathers. His was killed in a driving accident, then my mother remarried mine. There is this woman's blood between us, a fact confirmed by the traces of her still left on our faces. You can tell sometimes in profile, in government documents, but not much else between us. Gobelin, mi hermano, mi carnal. Gobelin is, Gobelin is, well, 1, a dick, but 2, Gobelin is a Dodgers cap. My brother Gobelin spent the majority of his youth playing baseball for Mexico's local and international little leagues, which means that I spent the majority of my youth waiting in the stands for the bullshit to be over so I could get back to Power Rangers. Es que ya me aburrió. And I always hated the way that he would drink beer and scratch his balls in public. At the time, putting my finger anywhere near my crotch was completely out of the question. Things have changed. We evolve.
Ahí les va, ahí les viene desde Ciudad Juárez, Chihuahua, el zurdito de oro.
El zurdito de oro. Golden left-handed pitcher. Since age 8 or 7, depending on the historian. My brother Gobelin was a small star of Mexican Little League, a Midas touch for the all-American pastime. My mother says about this, the small period of time when my brother was a small star of baseball, that he could have been anything, anybody. What she means is that he could have been a citizen, because that's what it means to be anything, anybody. Once, when Gobelin was 14, he was recruited to play for Mexico's international little leagues. And so he goes to San Diego with them. And there, the story goes, this American woman offers him sponsorship for citizenship, for guardianship, all the fucking ships. He declines the offer. I wouldn't have done that shit. Turned down nice white lady help, like, I'll take it. I mean, what else you got? My mother says that Gobelin is not like that because he's an Arriola. And Arriola men are machos with terrible fates, doomed to tragedies of pride. No shit. His great-great-grandfather's body was filled with bullets in a shootout in Chihuahua. His grandfather's lower body was devoured by one of those machines that till soil. And his father was crushed in his car in a tree in a driving accident. Like, if that shit is not a curse, I don't know what is, yeah? And it's at this point that my mother says that he stopped playing baseball and chose to drink too much and hang out with 40-year-old men, and she always hated the way that he would drink beer and scratch his balls in public. She hated the way that he was becoming a man like my father, like his father, a spoiled thing. She wanted that golden left hand to become the all of him, and now he was the worst kind of anybody you could be. He still loves the Dodgers, though. One Christmas, he finished a whole bottle of tequila by himself. And he's sitting there watching an old Dodgers game. And his damp face and his little whimpers let me know that I should pretend to stay asleep on the couch. And what could be more American than crying over a game of baseball? Like what could be more American than longing for something you could never have through a television screen and having nothing but nostalgia rotting in your gut? And his faggoty little brother, all better lifed out on the couch. What dazzling, patriotic spics we were that night. Mi carnal y yo. In Spanish, we sometimes use the word carnal to refer to our brothers. Like quite literally, we use the word carnal to refer to our relationship to one another. Like, ¿qué pasó, carnal?
All right, I'll stop it there.
Of the flesh.
But yeah, that's a clip. That's something that happens in the show.
Yeah.
I will say Jesus and I got a lot of mileage out of my being like, oh, this is like this movie from the 80s called The Natural, which Jesus had never seen. I'm just like, I'd explain the entire plot, and like this, baseball star, mysterious woman, Barbara Hershey became our patron saint of the show. And but I think that moment, I think it stands out particularly because I was reading recently the play Our Dad is in Atlantis, which is a play by a Mexican playwright about two small boys whose father is in Atlanta, and they have been left in Mexico, and eventually they go to try to find their father. It is a devastating play, and it talked about how quite often some of the first Latinx people that get big in the US do because of baseball, and I immediately thought about Jesus's brother at that point, and how it is this. It's like it's there's this moments in this where like we get glimpses of like the immigrant story that you get called upon to tell, particularly if you are like, and not just by the state, not just by white audiences, but also by like a lot of Latinx like audiences and theater goers, theater makers, who are sort of like who are about, let's prove ourselves through our art. Let's prove ourselves worthy of citizenship, or let's prove ourselves worthy of acceptance, and how this so could easily have been, oh, the story of this incredibly talented young baseball player going to the United States and being in Little League. There's something almost, Hallmark movie about it, but that these stories of exceptionalism, don't do anything to actually change the system itself, but at the same time being like, I mean, why turn down nice white lady help? And so it's a moment that I always really, really loved, not least because also of just sort of like, I have been bored at many a baseball game, and relate on that regard as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think also like there was a moment early on in the show, in the rehearsal process, where I think I was like, am I the villain? Like, am I the villain in the show? And Rudy, it eventually makes the script, but in that moment, Rudy had this conversation that was like with me about like, yeah, how is it that we sometimes take countries as lovers, and we invest in them as we would someone we want desperately to want us and to love us, and a country can't love, right? Like, by its design, a country is actually always in the service of itself, which means it's always in the service of wealth, which means that it's always in the service of whoever owns or is operating or orchestrating the wealth in that country, which means that like the love of nation is actually like a myth. What you love most about your nation is actually a love for the land, or maybe like a love for the people that you love there. But it gets sold to you as a love for a country. And so you end up doing things like renouncing, your history inside of an oath to make sure that like the US thinks you're pretty. And the US will never think you're pretty. And so I think, yeah, I've been having, I think, a lot of, since I've been doing the show, I think a lot of like journaling and thinking about and writing through like what exceptionalism also means, not just as like an option that exists, but actually like part of the damaging mechanism, right? Like every time I was exceptional as a child, I gave this country a reason to deport my brother. Like every time I became someone different than who my brother was, I gave the country the contour and shape for the metrics that they could use to deport someone like him. And that I think that's like the sort of like survivor's guilt that I think a lot of us who are from mixed status families move in and carry with us.
Yeah, and I think that thank you for reminding me about that, because about the idea of sort of the romantic relationship, because it's something that I remember particularly from around the time of the strong push for same-sex marriage, was like, why do we need the validation of the state? And on the one hand, there are plenty of reasons why you would want it for insurance reasons, for income reasons, for visiting people in hospital reasons, but at the same time, like the word marriage itself is so much about like this saying, this desire for the state recognition, of saying like, I want the state to recognize this, and rather than saying, what if we change the nature of how insurance works, of how hospital visitations works, about how things like those work. And it's interesting because I think it's the thing that I was saying earlier about sort of like, both like, the homophobia, the queerphobia, the transphobia in a lot of like Latinx rights organizations or movements versus like the racism in a lot of, like mainstream gay liberation. It's like romantic rivalry, it's like, and like you're saying, it's just like, I am proving that I am one of you by saying I am not them. and it's almost like saying like, like it's who is which group is going to get the rose at the end of the hour. It's very, it's this it's a the state inspires that competitiveness and that exclusion.
I really appreciate this discussion and all that you all are offering. I'm teaching a class this quarter, Diverse Experiences in American Drama, and I'm hearing so many of the things that we've been talking about in that class pop up in what you're saying, right? The ways in which this naturalization process is dehumanizing in a lot of ways, right? And one of the things a lot of my students reflected on was that people who are born here don't know the answers to the questions and don't know what you have to know to go through the naturalization process, right? And so just like reflecting on all the labor that is asked. And so then hearing you talk about that exceptionalism, right? And what is being asked from the country, that you be exceptional in order to be here when, I'm just a regular, but like, I don't think I'm exceptional, right? And I was just born here, but that gives me all of those rights and protections, right? And so hearing, I don't know, something about the way that you phrased that was really powerful to think about, that the exceptionalism carved that standard, right? And that the country asks that and requires that of its immigrants.
Yeah, I mean, I will always take the chance to talk about being annoyed by Hamilton. But it is, that I mean, I think it is that it's that thing where, that like I was, again, like I'm studying, like Latinx theater specifically this semester, and thinking about how there was so much writing on it, like sort of before like Lin-Manuel Miranda comes onto the scene, and then like, and Hamilton becomes the biggest thing ever. But I mean, that it's that same story that it's selling about, like, you were like how the immigrant is that it's the exceptional immigrant, and just saying like that this person like is so much greater and so much better and so much more elevated than everyone else, and it's just and in doing so like is thus perfectly aligned with America. It's like the exceptionalism that America demands is then the exceptionalism that it uses to commit its violence, that it uses to oppress, that it uses to dominate in all these other ways.
I want to offer into the space some of the comments that are coming in from YouTube. Jackson offers, I absolutely love the use of sound design from the clip that you showed. Dawn offers, yeah, I even loved how the stories were told. Christina, powerful and real. And Dawn, again, very raw too.
Yeah, shout out to Johan Mahler, our sound designer.
Yeah, Johan's
amazing. And for us, I think it was really important to have the sound, like, I think particularly like in the beginning of it, as Jesús is reading the document of the citizenship documents in the beginning, that having them be echoed in Spanish as well, was something that I really wanted to make sure that we heard. And this idea, because of thinking about how it's read, how it's encountered, and how it is translated in various ways. And then to the point when we get there, all of that is like distorted and made and carries that sense of like wanting to rip through it, because Spanish is also a colonial language, so it gets you coming and going.
Ed offers powerful and passionate American in a most ironic way. A multidimensional look at culture too often left out in American history and culture. My only critique, he's a Dodgers fan.
Yeah. I mean, like, especially like, it's also weird to be like, I don't know. I absolutely am enamored in the specific ways that a lot of like Mexicans and Mexican Americans love the Dodgers. I mean, like, it's a thing. Um, and also then you look at like the history of the Dodgers as a team and like the histories of displacement attached to like Chavez Ravine, and you're like, ooh, it's a very, like, oof, like talk about like violent, like relationships with the team. But yeah. When the Dodgers won, they won like what, 2 years ago? Was it no last year? When was it? They won something recently. Here we are, theater people being like, what? But I remember my parents like sent me like a picture of them in like Dodgers gear. My mother, who like doesn't really care that much for baseball, but like she's in like these Dodgers socks, and it was interesting because they knew how important it was to my brother, who then changed like the day they won. I want to say it was within the past year. He in our home in Juarez, where he lives now after being deported, he has like a room of just like Dodgers memorabilia. I mean, it's the room he sleeps in, it's his room. That's also all mixed in with like old clippings from when he was like playing baseball. And he set up all of his like Dodgers memorabilia on a bed and took a picture of it. And that's his like Facebook photo now. Thank you. 2020 World Series. And I think there was like that it's still his picture, and that he's still clinging on to this like vestige of Americanness, and that it still is something that he can sort his own like Mexicanidad through. It's the strangest sort of like psychic passport that I think he affords himself to be here in some way, or with us in some way, or them with him when they put on their Dodgers socks. So I don't know. I think there's a lot to be said about about the sort of like imagined country of team fandoms too.
Yeah. And I think like it's interesting, how that it parallels so much with like there's the moment when when Jesús like sets foot in America, like has been there, but like this is like the first sort of like the shift happens, is going into a convenience store, and we're just like, oh, like again, Johan beautifully like turned like the ding of going into a 7-Eleven into goes from that ding into pure imagination from Willy Wonka, when you get that image of Fran Drescher, and as like Lady Liberty on the cover of a magazine. And I think that I've really come to be fascinated because like as that as the generation that grew up on The Nanny is able to write think pieces, I think that there's like this that particularly like how Fran Drescher being like that being from a working or lower middle class Jewish background in Flushing, Queens, and going into this like WASP, like super fancy New York townhouse, where everyone is blonde, and that the clothing is too colorful and the hair is too big and she wears too much makeup, and just how so many people, like I think both queer people, like Latinx people who are part of other outsider communities beyond, beyond being Jewish, are like, oh, that's the person I connect with. That's someone who I really, really love, and like loving that story itself. So I think that getting into the idea of that, like, when you are like that, loving America is never about loving America, it's about loving people in it. It's like there is also like even love for that story of like, well, here's the person who's not supposed to fit in anywhere, and yet she's exactly what everyone needs. So like those stories are, like they are seductive in ways that are very real, and I think that I like how this piece plays with how the piece shows both like the queer version and the much more like conventionally cishet, you know, baseball boy version.
One of the things that I am hearing as you're talking, and I feel like we've said a little, you said a little bit, but I would love to know more. And I think it goes back to, you made a statement early on, Jesus, about what the body can write, right? And then thinking about this exceptionalism again, and like the body being part of that exceptionalism, right? And the requirements of being a citizen, right? And so I would love to hear both of you just kind of reflect on, if you can, about the body and what the body knows, and what that plays a part, how that plays a part in this piece.
Yeah, I just did like a guest lecture at a class here at Brown maybe like 3 days ago, and somebody asked, like, you know, like what do you miss most about, like, you know, what is important about performing the show live? And anytime I've been asked that question during the pandemic, I always go to like sweating. Like I miss sweating in front of an audience, and I say that because for several reasons. One, and to go back to our sort of conversation about fatness earlier, I think there is something about having a piece that is sort of, I mean, like in the piece, I take one break for water, which is almost like 3/4 of the way through. I'm almost done, and then I sort of stop, take a drink of water, and then finish the piece. And it's really interesting to sort of like, there's been a lot of people who have been like, who'll come up to me after the show and they'll be like, your body, I mean, like you do so much with your body. And what I hear sometimes in that is also like, you're so brave, which is the forever like fat compliment of like, I didn't know you were able to move. But there's so much of you. And I think there's something really interesting about what happens whenever someone watches an abject body move in a way that they find beautiful, that they find sort of like striking, or they're moved by it. Because then you're being moved by the thing that repulses you, right? By the thing you actually don't want to be. And so for me, I think there's a moment where I keep thinking about all of the ways that citizenship moves, not just on the paper, but in how we refrain from wanting, from being fat, from being like too queer, from being too much, right? Like citizenship requires lack, right? It requires the subject to abstain in order to gain its Americanness, even as it's producing virtuosity, right? And so I think one thing that I'm really, I've been really sort of like encouraged in thinking about like what footnotes is my body providing the moment that it starts to perform, right? That there is the text, yes, and also how my body is being received, and that it is my body, and that it looks like this, and that it's sweating, and actually like and that it's present and making smells and sounds and breath inside of a theater with people, right? Which is the thread of like, which is, in our COVID brains, the thread of contagion, yes, and also the forever thread of contagion of theater, right? That the thing you're watching is eventually going to stick to you in some way. That like the ephemera is going to, like the patina of what you've just watched be performed is going to leave with you, and maybe infect like the world outside. And so I think like, I'm really interested in like the body as threat, as promise, as danger, as the best thing we can actually be, which is dangerous, in the best ways possible, right? And in ways that are also scary and difficult and maybe violent too. And I think finally, like I was also in this class, I was talking a lot about like my own concern and appreciation for labor, right? That like the theater is labor, and the artist is a labor, and the more that we encourage ourselves to not think of art as labor, which, and there are ways in which that is maybe reductive and like, capitalist, but I also think when we dismiss art as labor, we dismiss one, the very like real physiological things that performing demands, and that performing does to our bodies. But two, I also think we sometimes dismiss like the dignity that all workers globally deserve when they're exerting their bodies. And that I think, I don't know, I want audiences to see me sweat because I want them to see the work. My friend always talked about like figure skating programs as being beautiful because they make you forget that labor happened, right? Like the ease through which the performer moves is the thing that allows you to never actually consider the work that happened in the rehearsal room or the exertion of the muscle or bone that is creating the beauty you're watching. And I want to remind you, like, I'm like, no, like my body can't help but remind you that it's like sweating and breathing hard and moving through performance. So yeah, that's some thoughts on the body.
Yeah, I think that's really great because I the body has become such a like central the things that I think about. I think in some ways, because like for the longest time, and still, I was so enamored of solo performance, and a lot of the solo performers that I really fell in love with were ones who I fell in love with because of the text itself. And I thought of myself as like, oh, well, I would write more than I would do other things. And when I started doing my own solo performance work, I was very much like, listen to the text that I'm giving you, and particularly being in front of queer audiences, they're like, I can't pay attention that long. Like, I want to go talk to that hot person over there. You got to do more to like keep my attention, when I could be like, macking on somebody right now. And so like, I got through camp, which was a queer open mic night in Austin, Texas for a few years. I got a really quick education in the body. And then, so as a director of this piece, the text was already incredible. And I always felt like my job was to say like, okay, let's take everything in this to the level of the incredible text. And so, I was always thinking about, all right, what is the movement vocabulary that we can set up, and work with. We did all sorts of things like, I think on one day, or maybe it just collapses in my head, like looking both at, Samuel Beckett's Not I, which is like the thing where it's just like a tight spotlight on the mouth and the mouth talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking and talking. And then also like Elaine Sturgis' performances, because of just how specific she is about every single little thing that she does in her one-woman show, where it's like every single line she has thought very specifically about her actions and everything on that line, and giving it some stage presence, that then becomes like, about isolating the mouth, talking about like, particularly, I think, how we don't think about language as embodied, but one of the first things that happens in this play is Jesús, as a child, practicing saying American, and not saying American, but saying American, and how that requires such control of the mouth at such a refined level to sell someone on, I'm here and I've always been here. And his sister was like, it was the first spell, the first lie you ever told a man, you liked it. And so I think that the body here acts as that which can never be contained by these documents, and the body acts as that which, as I was saying, is the footnote for the text, and also like the counter melody. It's just like this that's like playing alongside and saying like, there's work that as incredible as the text is, there's work that the body can do that the text can't, and vice versa. And so they have to work together to convey this, and that they are irreducible.
Oh. I'm so enjoying this, and thank you both so much. Yeah, just reflecting on the body, right, and all the ways that you're thinking about it and how it, I don't know, Rudy, the way that you articulated, right, that speech is an embodied thing that we don't think about.
It's really, really true. I mean, I think that that, you know, it's so many ways in which I say, like, it's like how accent is policing, you know. It's just like, I mean, I think about like, I mean, like, you know, Natasha, you and I have worked together on working on good Appalachian accents, you know, and thinking about that and thinking about just like how, you know, we are so often marked by the way we speak, and it requires a very careful paying attention to the body to change that, you know, or to, like, in some cases, to adamantly hold on to it as well.
And that's something else that I think you called it policing. I'm also hearing like discipline, right? And the ways in which our bodies are disciplined. Jesus, you're talking about the sweating on stage and the labor of the body. And I feel like oftentimes theater, especially in a US context, wants us to hide that labor, wants us to discipline our bodies in a way that we hide the nuance, the daily parts of it, right? The sweating and the out of breathness, right? Like all of those things that I feel like theater tries to get us to hide.
Mm-hmm.
And so then disciplining our bodies to not sweat, to say the words in a certain way, to move in a certain way, breathe in a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And yeah, I think, like, to also, like, what, you know, Jesús said about, like, again, it is absolutely that thing of yeah, like, it's like it's like, oh, you're a fat person who is moving your body, you're so brave, you know, or like, and like, this is something that, like, I've experienced in various contexts, you know, and so I think that it's a statement in many ways of just of like, that is on some level just like the worst thing to hear, and on some level so just like, Jesus, but it's like, but also nevertheless true, you know, like the idea that it does require, like, that it does require courage to be certain kinds of bodies on stage, you know, and doing certain kinds of things as those bodies on stage, and that it is that there is inspiration that happens in a very necessary way, you know. I think that, like, that particularly, again, I think in here that the body is not just exerting itself, but insisting upon its desirability, you know, in doing so, and insist, and like reminding us, like, you know, yeah, this body does have, you know, this body is interpolated in ways that are violent, you know, but it is also a subject in desiring, and it is also desired. I think are really powerful things happening here.
One of the things that I often talk about, right? I also think, like I said, a lot about fatness in theater and how do we make our spaces safer, right? Like all of those sorts of things. And one of the things I often talk about is we have to retrain our eyes, right? We have to retrain our eyes to see fat bodies. And in a lot of ways, retrain our eyes to see any othered body, right? As beautiful, as virtuosic, as whatever, because what we often see is not that, right? We see thin white bodies, able bodies, right? As that is what a virtuosic body looks like, right? And so part of the importance of seeing that is so that we can relearn how to even see and understand and read bodies.
Yeah, I think I mean, I think that's also like a Rudy and I were recently working on a project about Lorca and revisiting Lorca's work. And I was working on an adaptation of Yerma, which eventually became really like a play about having wants so large and bodies so undisciplined that they become incredibly powerful, right? That they become the only thing. And I think one conversation that happened at a rehearsal that I wasn't even at, it was like a recorded, but the actor that was playing the lead in that reading at one point was like, yeah, doing this process, I think also almost all of the characters in the play are fat. Like, I think there's like 2 that aren't, and they aren't fats for specific reasons, and everyone else is just fat. And I think the person playing the lead, they were like, yeah, in doing this and in sort of being part of this reading, even as short as the process is, I think I've been thinking a lot about how often I can't imagine a lead role as a fat person, right? Like, I imagine myself as an actor, and I imagine myself as like forever in like a character role, or like, at best you get like a really solid secondary, and you're usually either really funny or very mean, like one of the 2, like, and that's it. And so I think that I love what you said about retraining our eyes. I have such problems sometimes with adaptations whenever they're like, like, oh, it's Romeo and Juliet, but they're 2 beautiful women, and I'm like, and what they mean is like, like here are again 2 very like, conventionally sort of like Eurocentric attractive bodies, but now it's like, ooh, it's dangerous, and I'm like, no, like go for the more dangerous casting, actually, like go for the casting choice that is going to actually create a friction in the story, right? Because yeah, I think our interventions on and with text and in theater, I think also like, again, I'm so grateful for you, Natasha, like for that phrasing of retraining the eye, because I do think like so much of how we unmake the world that is killing us has everything to do with our ability to spot the things that are killing us in the first place, right? The things that are hurting us. So thank you for that.
Yeah. I think it reflects my own process of learning to be in my own fat body, right? And having to seek out images that weren't always right, like the characters that you get on stage, right? The maid, or the funny character or the evil character, always the fat person, right? That you see, and we see this in all of our media all of the time, right? And so just, it's not all about representation, right? Like there's so much more to it, but like the importance of being able to see, and even just like the reflection of the actor, right? Of, I can't even imagine myself in those roles because we don't see them.
Yeah, and that's, I think, like, I think over the last few years, I've become a little more barbed about the concept of representation. Mm-hmm. But I do think, like, yeah, like, what happens when we shift the word representation and instead think about representation as rehearsal for the world we want, right? Like, it's not that it's like, oh, this is the world arrived because someone got this role. No. Like, I am showing you, like, I am practicing inside of this thing what a world could look like if this was invited to the liberatory space.
I'm going to quote that line and keep that forever. Representation as rehearsal for the world that we want. Thank you for that language.
And I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, again, one of the reasons why I got so into solo performance in the first place was because for many years, it was the one time you could see like Latinx performers, queer performers, a lot of, like, you could see like Black performers telling their own stories in ways that were not like stereotypes, like Latinx performers, et cetera, and growing up on, like Whoopi Goldberg's first solo show, and like John Leguizamo and Hazel Goodman, and and then later on, like, like Tim Miller and Deb Margolin and et cetera, like all these amazing performers. And it's like, it speaks to, I think, why solo performance is still so important and so relevant, is that quite often you have to start there. You have to start there as a performer. Like even thinking about, like, Cameron Manheim, Wake Up, I'm Fat, like it's that you need to articulate your own story and tell your own story in your own way. If you are one of these bodies who is never allowed on stage, to really kind of get a lot of people thinking, oh, like they have a subjectivity. How incredible. I had no idea. And so and how so often those creators, then from there went on to explore that work more, and to be able to represent themselves as they wanted to take a more conscious control of that. It's like, it keeps happening. And I think about, like, how much I love, like, working on Yermo, this project with Jesús, is because, like, it puts, like a fat, brown, queer body front and center, and says that what this person wants can literally like spark the birth of a star. Like, it is magically powerful, when so often you are told that your desires are meaningless or worthless or will never come true. Instead, and shouldn't you stop wanting? Shouldn't you like, not just shouldn't you not eat this food, but shouldn't you not want to eat this food? And instead saying, no, I should want everything, and I am entitled to want as vastly as I can possibly imagine, is such a powerful thing. I really want Yermo to happen. I'm working on it.
Well, I think that is a good way to segue a little bit, because we've been kind of really focused on documents, but I would love to hear about what you're both working on now, either together or separately. Even what you're doing with Undocuments too, and where that's headed. Yeah, just tell us about what you're doing, all the cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, Undocuments now sort of has its own, like, critter life, and it's, it will be a part of Reencuentro 2021, which starts today. So if people want to look it up, just look up Latino Theater Company Reencuentro 2021, and you can find the roster of plays. So it's one of 16 shows, I think, that is going to be broadcast through the duration of the festival for 10 days. So it's all Latine theater makers and theater companies, all doing, like, from all over the country, sort of offering digital shows. So Documents will be a part of that. And, I'm taking it up, touring it to universities. I'll be in Seattle I'll be performing in Seattle this Friday at the National Communication Association convention. But yeah, in terms of new work, honestly, like, I think similarly as with Rudy, like, I'm really excited to make Yermo happen at some point. I had so much fun writing that piece, and sitting with Lorca and sitting with Yerma, which is a play that I really like. It's also become, I think, my favorite now in the trilogy. Like, as I was working on it, I was like, no, this is the play, actually, which is the one that I think people talk about the least. Currently working on, over the pandemic, I started watching I May Destroy You. And I still haven't been able to finish it. I have not watched the last episode yet. Every episode was really, really difficult to watch. And I think, I've been sort of sitting with and thinking about, and I'm going to use the word survivor, and I don't really know, like, what that means, right? I actually, like, resist the urge to sort of talk about, like, what it means to be, like, a survivor of sexual assault, or rather to live with, like, sexual assault as something that is part of your history instead. So the play that I'm currently working on is, it's three people at a table. It's a family play. It's a sort of, like, family, like, table play, except that through the course of the play, like the table and the earth and these people all crack open and move through different times as they deal with what it means to think of and believe that sexual assaults and the trauma that comes from it is an inheritance or an heirloom that's like bloodborne. And how do we, what interventions are there to be made, if not in this world, in the spirit world, to try to break some of those cycles? So I think the work is moving in that direction right now. So that's what I'm working on.
Yeah. So this summer we finished working on Yermo along with works by Pedro Casares and Cristo Gonzalez, based on the Lorca trilogy. And you know, I at first was like, I think half pretending to be embarrassed by it, but no, I think I'm fully embracing it now, is the fact that like this started from like Jesús and I like talking about like, you know, being, you know, fat queer Mexicans and particularly like dating various people. And so like I told like a sort of semi breakup story, and then that became like the kind of seed of the piece. And I'm really happy about it now, particularly because of the way that the play now ends. It's to me, it's again, it's a play that I read it and you know, yeah, I think about like how I've never seen, you know, fat queer desire centered in a play like this and celebrated, you know, and it's like, and looking at, you know, how we inherit, and speaking of inheritances, inheriting traumas around food, inheriting a lot of like, you know, I mean, we you know, we talked about like, you know, the moment that your mother stops baking you cakes, the moment your mother stops like making sweet, delicious treats for you, and instead it's like, oh, there's a, you know, like, and make sure that the freezer is full of lean cuisines and things like that, and Weight Watchers meals, and thinking about how what is the generational trauma that goes into that, and you know, how is each generation responding to one another's fears and concerns and desires around food. But at the same time, this play is ridiculously funny and sexy, and like ends with this like with an apotheosis, like with sex and death and apotheosis in the best queerest way. And it involves you know, a mom riding in on the back of a leather daddy, which is everything. And in the meantime, you know, I'm the biggest focus that I have right now is actually another thing that brought Jesús and I together was I have a really big love of Emma Goldman, who is a late 19th, early 20th century anarchist, whose life I find endlessly fascinating and inspiring. And so I'm taking the work that Jesús and I and Shannon Grounds and Jules and lots of other really awesome people worked on together, and I'm revisiting it and I'm making it into a musical. God help me. And so that's a project that I hope to be working on in the coming year and here at UMass Amherst. And I'm really excited about it.
So much great work. I can't wait for all of it. So we have a couple questions that we usually ask folks just to, you know, offer. A lot of our audience are undergraduates. So what is something you would tell your 18-year-old self?
Get the money first. No, but also get the money first. Well, get half when you make the agreement, and then the second half when the job is done. But I think I love that question, and also I actually have recently been thinking a lot about how much admiration I actually have for my younger selves. I think like my younger selves were far more like braver and reckless, but also more courageous than I think I've become and am sometimes. And so I actually would love to go back to that 18-year-old person and be like, girl, how are you doing it? Like, let me borrow some of it. But I think first and foremost, it took for me to be 27 and very sad to return to theater after leaving it when I graduated high school, because there was a part of my sort of like Mexican migrating self that was like, for what? Like, at theater for what? Like, what is that? How are you gonna make a living? And in an end of the world, right? Like, maybe not the end of the world, but in, you know, as the world shifts and you know, precarity becomes like a looming thing, I'm like, oh, like, what about just doing the thing that nourishes your soul, actually? Like, what about just allowing yourself to speak all of the languages that like your spirit has always wanted to speak? And for me, that's been writing and performing and collaborating with people who are lovely and terrifying and stupid and brilliant. And I think, yeah, just like give yourself permission to be an artist. And don't charge that with anything, right? Like, don't charge that with like, I'm going to be the best artist. Like, give yourself permission to be the full of the artist you want to be, whatever that means, and shape shift as much as possible.
Yeah. So as I said, like, you're gonna grow a beard for an acting role when you're 19. Keep it, and don't wait. But it's interesting how I feel like the big difference between Jesús and that regard is I think that I was terrified at that age and very cautious, extremely Capricorn, and so but at the same time, I also had the experience of like going on this path away from theater and only realizing that I had to go back to it when it was like, oh my God, I'm going to break if I don't. And I think like I would say to myself, like, be braver. You're better at this than you think you are, and you have more to offer than you think you do, and you're a lot hotter than you think you are. And realize if there's a lesson I've learned more than once that I really value, it's that the best choice is not always the right choice. That you can calculate all these things about the choices that you're making, but the one that adds up in your brain to like, that makes the most sense to me, is quite often the wrong choice, because it's kind of the chicken shit choice.
Okay. One perhaps last question. What are you finding essential right now to you? It doesn't have to be a difficult, doesn't have to be anything grand, right? I saw your face, Jesus.
It's just, I'm like, oh. It's interesting. Both Rudy and myself moved to graduate programs, in Massachusetts and Rhode Island during the pandemic, leaving like communities of theater folks that we built for a long time, for Rudy longer, but for me, like, significant enough that I was like, this is really sad. So I think I actually am really a thing I'm finding essential, and this is really weird, and I actually like think this is good though, is grieving. I actually think so many of us were kind of robbed of our ability to grieve inside of like a Trump administration collapsing on top of a pandemic. Like, I actually think it really restructured how we think about grieving, and whether or not we were able to do it. And I'm slowly finding myself sort of like in a kind of thaw where all of the small things that I sort of like froze and put away to grieve later are now sort of like cracking open and figuring out sort of like new, fun, creative ways to grieve things. Because loss for me usually signals change, and I actually like, I quite like change. I think I narrate myself as someone who resists it, but I actually think I like it. I think there's something about it that feels really nourishing. The step that happens before change, or that I think has to happen, is grief, right? Like, I think grief is actually the alchemy of what you do with loss, and where you move with it next. So yeah, I'm finding grieving really essential in various forms. Like I'll go watch a play or read a poem or drink a lot or hang out with a friend or eat a rotisserie chicken over the sink by myself. Whatever, little things.
Yeah.
My first year was like money's essential.
Very that, yeah, it checks.
But also because when you're in grad school, you think about that a lot. But I think to have a much more like evolved answer, I'm gonna go with perspective. I think perspective is very essential. Like, you know, the last thing that Jesus and I did in person before the pandemic hit was a piece about extinction called Last. And it really gave me this sort of very cosmic view of the planet, just like we are like the space between my fingers in terms of like our existence on this planet, and that, you know, it means everything passes, everything changes, as has said. And I think that I've come here and everybody has said like, you're so not stressed. You're so like chill and you don't lose your cool and things like, knock on wood. But like, but I mean, it's like, well, yeah, I mean, it's play. It's a play. We're making a play. You know, and if we're not having fun, if I'm making stress for people, then what's the point? And you know, we've been through such a horrible set of experiences, and I say that as somebody who went through this so relatively unscathed, like, but at the same time thinking about like grief and about like, I don't like to think about it because then I realize like, yeah, going through that as an extrovert was not the funnest time of my life. You know, but that so much of what I think at one point in my life I thought of as like live or die, make or break, is actually nothing in the larger scheme of things, and that it allows you to really sort of say like, all right, what are like, perspective allows you to approach things without letting them overwhelm you, hopefully. But then you also have those things where you're like, oh, now this is the priority of things. These are the things that you really do need to focus on, like health and stuff like that, like making sure that your body is still working in time. So I think I'll go with that.
Thank you both so much. We have 3 minutes left, so I think, well, 2 now. So I think we're about at the time to wrap up. Is there any last thought or thing that you would like to put into the space before I close us out?
Natasha, I miss you. You're awesome. That's my last thought.
I miss you too. We'll have to make more connections.
I was gonna say, just like really grateful for this space. It's been really awesome, and it's been so good to like be in conversation with you, Natasha, too. Like, it's been really wonderful. And I would love, honestly, I would love to like, I don't know, if we can get, I've been dreaming this as we've been talking. I'm like, if we can get ourselves there and maybe do a workshop of Guillermo with you, like just with you in the room, that'd be kind of amazing.
That sounds
even if it's like a one-day reading, like that'd be
theater. Let's make some
let's keep talking. We'll talk afterwards. Absolutely. That sounds exciting. Yeah.
Awesome.
Thank you both for being here so much. Thank you to the audience who is here. This closes us out for the fall quarter for dialogues, but we will have many more folks joining us in the winter quarter and spring quarter. So please be on the lookout as we bring in more artists and scholars and activists to talk about their amazing, amazing work. And if you want to get involved with dialogues, if you want to support this process and support these artists in any way, you're welcome to reach out to me. You can find my email on the CWU website. So yeah. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And thank you again, Rudy and Jesus.
Thank you.